Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to the 6th in the North Wessex Downs AONB series of webinars on farming and the environment. Today's talk is entitled Farmland Birds, Reversing the Decline in the North Wessex Downs. Some of you will have noted that we were going to update you further today on the proposed Farming and Protected Landscape programme, which was announced as part of the government's Agricultural Transition Plan last year. While we'd hoped to be able to bring you more detail, regretfully, we're not quite in a position to do so at the moment. What we can tell you, though, is that DEFRA is proposing a time-limited package of grants and engagements to help farmers and other land managers in protected landscapes. That's both AONBs and national parks. This programme is commencing later this summer. It will form part of the transition towards ELM, the proposed environmental land management support, by supporting farmers and land managers to deliver environmental outcomes. The scheme will deliver funding through the protected landscape bodies, including the North Wessex Downs AONB partnership, to support farmers in making improvements to the natural environment, cultural heritage, and public access on their land. We're sorry we're unable to give you further guidance or answer questions at this stage, but please do start thinking about possible ideas so that you are ready when DEFRA makes the announcement that the programme is opening, which we really hope will be soon. Before I introduce our speakers, a few bits of housekeeping. We will have some time for questions after the first part of the presentation, and then again after the section on countryside stewardship. The chat function is disabled, but at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button. Feel free to type in your questions or comments here whenever you like. I'm afraid we can't guarantee to answer all of them, but we will do our best to cover as many as we can before we finish. The webinar will be recorded, and afterwards you will receive an email with a link to the recording, which will be available on our YouTube channel. When you leave the webinar, please do take a moment to fill in the brief feedback questionnaire. It's really helpful to us if you can. Now, it's my very great pleasure to welcome our two presenters, Des Sussex and Neil Bucknell. I'm sure that Des Sussex will be known to many of you. He has been a lead advisor for Natural England since 2004, with much of his work helping farms in various stewardship schemes. Now, as team leader, he covers a variety of work in Berkshire and manages Natural England's national nature reserves from the Chilterns down to the Solent. Neil Buckner was brought up on a farm on the edge of the North Wessex Downs. An active bird watcher and surveyor since his school days, he has been both chair and president of the Berkshire Ornithological Club. He was a member of the groups that organised the first Berkshire Bird Atlas in 1987 to 89, and the second one between 2007 and 2011. He also co-authored 2 editions of the Birds of Berkshire, in which the results were published. He is a member of the Conservation Committee of the club and involved with organising surveys of farmland as part of their activities. Now, over to Neil and Des. Des, can you switch your camera on, and possibly Neil, switch yours off? Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, we can. All good, Des.
Okay, I'll just try and share my screen. Okay, has my first slide come up?
It has, yeah.
Please. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to everyone who's joined this session. Hopefully that means you've got an active interest in helping to conserve and restore farmland birds through your work and in your parts of the world. So I'm just going to start off with a brief sort of overview and summary as to why we even need to be worried about farmland birds. Then Neil will speak for a while, and later on I'll talk a bit more about some of the active measures that you can do to help farmland birds on your land. So the government has really embraced the environment and many different issues associated with environmental maintenance, management, restoration. Farmland birds have actually been of interest for many, many years. And in previous governments, farmland birds and their populations were taken to be a sort of quality of life indicator. And we had targets to try and restore the farmland bird populations and reverse the decline in their populations. Sadly, we haven't really achieved that. The current government has set out some ambitions in its 25-year environment plan. One of those ambitions being detailed in chapter 2 was to recover the recovery of nature and to enhance the beauty of landscapes. But what nature do we actually want to recover? There are lots of talk about different wildlife and habitats, different projects going on in the countryside, but farmland birds and farmland wildlife are still very central to our targets and objectives for wildlife recovery in the countryside. And a big mechanism for helping to achieve that is through the agri-environment schemes like Countryside Stewardship, and obviously the development of the future agri scheme ELMS. There's a plethora of documents and booklets and data and reports that detail the state of the UK's wildlife and birds. We're blessed in the UK with having a huge army of bird watchers, such as Neil and his team. So we have very good data for them, which is how we come to use their numbers as one of the indicators of the state of the countryside and the state of wildlife. We don't have quite such good data for some other wildlife groups, but birds we do. And we've got annual programs that involve small armies of volunteers going out to collect data, which is then analysed by people like the British Trust for Ornithology through contracts from government to help provide reports and advice. So the indicators of wildlife are sometimes turned into indices to show trends in their populations or numbers. The graph that you can see in front of you now is the graph going back to 1970 of the populations of breeding farmland birds in the UK. And I'll refer to this as the Farmland Bird Index. So DEFRA has used this indicator to help inform on the state of the farmed countryside for farmland wildlife for a number of years. We've got good bird data going back to 1970. So that's taken as being a reference point. That's not to say when that was when the bird populations were at the ideal or at the maximum. That's just when our good quality data goes back to. But you can see from the graph, we have 19 species of birds that make up this index. And if you lump all 19 species together, you get the green line, which you can see showed a steep decline through the 70s and 80s, and then a shallower decline continuing to the present day. That continued decline is very worrying, particularly as we've had stewardship schemes in place across the countryside for many, many years. We had old ESA schemes, the old Countryside Stewardship, we've had ELS, HLS, other systems. Now we've got the Countryside Stewardship scheme. So we've had mechanisms in place, but it hasn't managed to start that graph going back upwards. We need that graph going uphill to show that the bird populations are recovering. The 19 species includes some of the very common and familiar species that you'll know, like wood pigeons and jackdaws, starlings, as well as some of the more specialist species like lapwings and grey partridge, yellow wagtails and yellow hammers. So the whole Farmland Bird Index can actually also be split into the generalist species, the blue line at the top, which you can see is doing okay, but has started to drop. But very worryingly, the specialist species, 12 species, have shown even more severe declines, and an overall decline of over 55% since 1970. So which species are we really talking about? the farm bird index, from this slide, we've got the linnet, the yellowhammer, the reed bunting in the middle, the skylark, the barn owl down in the bottom right. Some of our favourite farmland birds there, the skylark and barn owls, are iconic species of farmland. And on this slide, the grey partridge, the yellow wagtail, which is a summer visitor, the lapwing, which used to be much more widespread and much more plentiful on almost all farms. In the middle, the corn bunting, the bottom, the tree sparrow, and the turtle dove. The turtle dove being one of our most threatened birds that's declined by well over 90%. Through the data, we've actually identified which of the birds have the highest conservation concern. And every, I think 5 or 6 years, the agencies produce lists of which species are of the highest concern and which species are doing a bit better. And the red list is the one that we are most concerned about, with showing species which in the last 25 years have had declines of over 50% in their population and or over 50% reduction in their distribution, which means that they've really retracted to small parts of the countryside. The amber list is species that have fared a little better than that, but still not doing well at all, between 25 and 50% decline in population or distribution. And you can see from the next slide that some of our farmland birds, which should be very familiar and widespread and plentiful in the countryside, most of them actually appear on the red list. They've had very, very extreme declines in the last 20 or 25 years. Species like the grey partridge, the turtle dove, the tree sparrow, all declines over 90%. Some of you on the call have hopefully got some of these species still on your farm. And on some farms, some of these species like the corn bunting in the North Wessex Downs, some farms have actually still got plentiful numbers of species like that. But please don't be misled that that's the case across the wider countryside. Some of these species really are rare now, which is a great shame. And even a species like the skylark, which should be 2 a penny in every field, its numbers have declined due to various reasons. So what were those reasons for the declines? Agriculture has changed massively since the Second World War, in many ways for the good, to provide us with food. And in many cases, that's been the result of fantastic improvements in technology, cropping, different availability of different chemicals and fertilizers, and different types of machinery and soil husbandry. So we as a nation have benefited by the provision of food, but some of those benefits that were received have been at the consequence of impacting wildlife and habitats very seriously. So some of the big reasons for declines in birds, in breeding birds on farms, has been the big shift from previously there would have been a lot more spring crops, which would have also resulted in having lots more weedy, seedy stubbles. We find that the autumn sown crops like winter wheat are often far too dense by early spring. They're growing so thick and growing very well in terms of producing a crop, but the birds like skylarks and some of the other songbirds are unable to nest in them successfully once they become too dense. The increase in the use of fertilizers and herbicides and insecticides have had various impacts, either in removing food sources or in changing some of the habitats around the fields. The loss of flower-rich hedgerow bases, for instance, due to spray drift near hedgerows. Some hedgerows now, it's unfortunately just cleavers and coarse grasses and nettles around the bases of the hedge rather than the old flower-rich hedge banks. The decline in mixed farming has had an effect on many birds. Also, the reduced diversity of crops, increased field sizes, A tendency on some estates for block cropping, where you have large areas of land set across to a very low number of crops, so very low diversity, very homogeneous type of farmed landscape in some places. And then there's also been the loss or deterioration of actual habitats that many of the farmland birds would use. So things like the hedges and ponds, ditches and meadows. In many cases, we've still got plenty of hedges and ponds in parts of the countryside, but they've been polluted or degraded, or they're just not in the right structure and condition that they need to be to really benefit our farmland birds when they're trying to get through the different parts of their life cycle through the year. The consequence of some of those impacts on our birds, and I'm whizzing through a lot of this, obviously, so I apologise if you feel I'm rushing on some of this, but the consequences, why have those things actually reduced the number of birds? Well, the consequences have been a reduced availability of safe nesting habitats. Even where there is nesting habitat, birds are often unable to have the same number of nesting attempts that they used to. So a bird like the Skylark, for instance, could and perhaps should be having 3 successful nests during the spring and early summer. And sometimes they're reduced to having just 1 nesting attempt. There's reduced chick survival because there just isn't enough insect food out there for the parents to feed their chicks successfully. And also reduced overwinter survival because there's not adequate food sources to keep them going through the winter. So there's some of the impacts on birds. I'm now going to hand over to Neil and try and stop sharing my screen and hand over to Neil, who's going to tell you a little bit more about some of the birds in the Wessex Downs.
Thanks, Des. I will now try and make certain I can share my screen. Hang on a second. Let me just, I hope I've got this right. Hang on, I've just got that wrong, actually. Back to where we were before. Forgive me while I fumble a moment with the technology. And I just need to from the beginning and then back to, hang on, I'm struggling a little bit here. It all worked very well a few minutes ago before we started. Let me just quickly, I may end up sharing with the thing open from the side. I would apologise if I do that. Okay, let me just do that. Right, okay, well, I think you can see that. Let me just
yeah, we can, Neil, all's good.
Oh, that's brilliant. Okay, that's great. Sorry about that. Yes, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how some of the birds we've got, some of the very good birds we've got, and also explain a little bit as to why the parts of the AONB are really quite important for some of these threatened birds, some of the birds that are in decline, because we have got some good areas left. Just I hope to incentivise you to try even harder, as it were, in your land management, to provide regimes that will help them hopefully survive and prosper. So a little bit of background. Des has told you about the Farmland Indices, which are compiled from annual surveys, and they record across the nation as a whole and within the regions overall numbers of birds, and they're what have shown the declines in numbers that he's given to you. But there's a second set of surveys been undertaken. Periodically over the last 50 odd years, we've had National Bird Atlas surveys, and they're designed to not so much deal with numbers, but also how distributions are changing, because it's fine to know that it's good or bad, as the case may be, to know that numbers are going down, but we also need to monitor how the distribution is changing to see where the problems arise. We've had 3 generations of these. The first one in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The book on the left there on your screen was the first National Bird Atlas. repeated in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the second atlas, and then again 2007 to 2011, a third atlas. And if you like looking at maps, there's something called the Bird Atlas Map Store you can find on the BTO website, where comparison maps, some of which I've copied for this talk, can be found, and you can see what's happening. Now, in parallel, especially after the second atlas survey, people have started to do surveys on a lot finer scale. The national atlases are done on a 10-kilometre square basis. In other words, that's 100 square kilometres. So it's not very good for at the kind of level we operate on, actually monitoring what's happening, because, you know, if you start off with birds across most of an area in the first survey, and you've only got 2 or 3 left in that big area at the second, it will still be shown on a national scale as being present. With the advance of technology and home computing, the local bird atlas movement has built up, and this has resulted in a lot of material being collected and published, which shows what's happening on a much finer local scale. And we're lucky in the AONB because all the counties covered have undertaken now 2 generations of bird atlas surveys. So we do actually have some good information as to what's happening to the birds locally in terms of the change of distribution. On this slide here are the published, where it's been published in book form, all the books that have been published, and also some of it's only been published on the web. For example, the second Birds of Wiltshire survey was only done as a web publication, not as a paper publication. But and I'll be showing you some of the maps for Berkshire and Oxfordshire, as well as publishing books. We've also published a bird atlas. It's actually the Thames and Chiltern Birds Atlas, so it covers Berks, Bucks, Oxon and Hertfordshire. So I have to apologise in advance. You're going to see lots of maps in the next few slides, because there sadly isn't one particular publication for the AONB. There are bits from various publications that I'll be referring to. So let's have a look at some of the important species that we have. This again is just from the same information Des showed you, some of the birds that we have here in varying numbers and what's happening to them nationally, and those rather frightening figures that Des gave you again reproduced there. And we'll be looking at some of these species and what's happened to them in the AONB. So let's start off with one that there's been a lot of work about, the Grey Partridge. I mentioned that at the national scale, you can't always pick up what's happening. The map on the right there is the BTO Atlas comparison map between the late 60s and the last survey that was done. And it doesn't really seem to look that bad. Okay, you can see there's been a clear retreat out of the southwest of England, but of course that is at a large scale. On the right is the Thames and Chiltern Atlas map, plotted at a 2 kilometre square basis, which all these local atlases are done at. The AONB is in the, let me just see if I haven't got a pointer on this, have I? No, I haven't got, whoops, gone backwards. Is in the, part of it is in the bottom left here. All the red symbols are squares in which the partridge disappeared between the late 1980s and 2007 to 2012. And you'll see that it has largely disappeared from most of the low ground in those counties. And what on the remaining population is on the high tops of the Berkshire Downs, a few in the Chilterns, and rather more up in Bedfordshire. So quite a dramatic picture when compared to the national picture. Looking at the other counties, in Wiltshire, the AONB being kind of like centre right of the county there, actually the position in the AONB is worse. And it has been lost now from quite large parts of the AONB in Wiltshire, few left in the south. And just to show a really dramatic graphic representation, the map on the right is for the whole of Hampshire, the AONB here being in the sort of top left. And you'll see that rather frightening number of being lost from nearly 500 squares still present in about 100, and just a few where it has actually appeared where it wasn't before. So really some quite dramatic contractions in range, even in the AONB. Similar story for the lapwing. Again, the national picture looks quite good, doesn't it? Most of the bank map seems to be pink, so we've still got lapwings. On the right is again from Thames and Chilterns, and again the same thing. Grey is where it was present in both surveys, red is where it's gone, and you'll see once again it has disappeared from a lot of the river valleys, and once again in the bottom left on the Berkshire Downs, the part of the AONB, that's one of the better areas now for lapwing in the area covered. In Wiltshire, again, a few more losses in the AONB here, but still reasonably well present there. But again, in Hampshire, a rather more gloomy picture, widespread losses all over, and less of a pattern of the AONB remaining as a stronghold. Lapwing is though a species of considerable concern, because in the 10 years or so since the last Atlas survey, they do seem to have declined further. I'm running some farmland surveys with our club, and we've done 5 survey plots this year up on the Berkshire Downs, and there's not a single lapwing territory being revealed in all of those, and I think that is a worrying sign. Slightly different picture for the yellow wagtails. Perhaps a larger national decline shown on the national map on the left, but there's an interesting thing happening here. On the right, Thames and Chiltern map, again, the red is where it's gone, and you'll see it's gone from most of the river valleys, which was the traditional place we expected to find yellow wagtails. Not very many green spots, not very many grey spots rather, but quite a lot of green spots, which are places where it was found in the second survey, but not in the first. And I just draw your attention again to the Berkshire Downs and also parts of the Eastern Chilterns in North Hertfordshire, where you'll see they've started to breed. Now, it's not quite as rosy as that sounds, because the breeding density and breeding numbers in farmland tend to be fairly low. They are opportunistic breeders. So the green spots here represent 3 or 4 breeding seasons, so they won't necessarily be there in every year. But it's interesting to see this shift in habitat use. Similarly there in Wiltshire, rather less rosy on the AONB. You'll see actually there's some losses there in northeast central Wiltshire, but still a few in the AONB. I can't show you a Hampshire map because yellow wagtails actually became extinct as a breeding species in Hampshire between the two surveys. But I've just shown you there the Berkshire only map, which rather shows the brown spots are where it was in the 1980s, and you'll see mostly in the river valleys. The red spots is where it was 10 years ago, where you see they've retreated up onto the downs. Corn bunting, another bird that's one of our iconic birds, really. National picture, that does show, I think, a pattern that's reflected in our local ones. It's retreating onto the chalk farmland, downland areas of Britain throughout. It's moved out of a lot of the areas where it used to be. And it was already in quite severe decline by the 1980s when the base map here would have been drawn up. And again, in the Thames and Chilterns area, now largely confined to the Berkshire Downs and also parts of Bedfordshire. In good population still in Wiltshire and the AONB, but absent elsewhere. But in Hampshire, it is now pretty much disappeared. Even in the AONB, you'll see there are not many grey areas, grey squares there, indicating that it is still present. Here's a bird where I won't show you any maps other than the national map because there's hardly any left. Sadly, tree sparrow, which when I was a lad in the 1970s was still not an unusual bird to see, suffered a dramatic decline in the 1980s. That's the national breeding distribution now shown on the left. You'll see it's retreating for some reason north and eastward across the country. There are no breeding populations anywhere in the AONB apart from in Wiltshire. And on the right is a picture of the tree sparrow's champion, Matt Pryor, who has been running a tree sparrow monitoring and encouragement scheme on the North Marlborough Downs. That's him there carrying out some ringing. He's got a nest bot scheme and has been cooperating with some farmers there who have some livestock units on the edge of the downs and encouraging them to make provision for tree sparrows. We did try some tree sparrow work in Berkshire, but it hasn't really helped. Now, a bird I hope some of you are already involved with is the stone curlew. It's been the focus of conservation action now for about 30 odd years. I can't show you any change maps because for confidentiality reasons, we've decided not to publish those because they are very prone to disturbance. The national distribution is shown there, and the North Wessex Downs and Salisbury Plain represents one of 2 population centres in the country. It's been a successful campaign that's kept population levels up in the last 30 odd years, but it's not universally successful. The Hampshire Atlas did publish a change map, but those squares there are not actually where the stone curlews are. What they've done is they've shown within each 10-kilometre square the number of squares where they're still present. The good news is in the AONB in the northwest of the county, they've had some success. You'll see there's one of the squares there where it's gone from just 2 2-kilometre squares to 8 2-kilometre squares that now have breeding stone curlews. On the other hand, elsewhere in the county, notably Cranbourne Chase down in the southwest, they seem to have lost them entirely. So while we've had some good action in the AONB, not the case elsewhere. Another species you might not immediately think of as a downland bird is curlew. I mentioned them because we do have a small population in the AONB, and it's a slightly unusual story. The map on the left is the distribution change. You may have heard in the papers there's now a lot of concern about curlews. It almost disappeared from Ireland, but it used to be a stronghold. And they've disappeared from a lot of the upland areas in Britain where they used to be a reasonably common bird. The map on the, the map on the right is, I think, rather more informative. This is the BTO map showing the areas where it's increasing or declining. And you'll see that most of the country has got that sort of slate grey and fairly dark to show that it's in decline in all of those areas. And you might think, well, where is the downland ones in that? Well, the problem is actually our populations are very small. We've been monitoring them in Berkshire and we've only got probably, well, we had 3 sites and I think we're now down to 2 sites where it's been breeding. But that actually is a new arrival because they didn't used to breed on the downs until about the 1980s. They were associated in, for example, Thames and Chilterns with the Upper Thames tributaries. They used to be a bird of wet meadows by rivers. And although there are still some there, they've been a loss for a lot of those areas. And the map on the left shows the green is where curlews were recorded in 2007 to 2011 for the first time. And you'll see there's been a spread from an initial pair up at Aldworth to quite a number along there, although that doesn't actually, those are sightings and that rather overstates the position. Whereas you'll see the Upper Thames around Oxford, a lot of those have disappeared. And again, there's a small population too, largely newly established in Wiltshire, which is good to see. One of the factors is climate change. There are 2 species here that I just show you because they have retreated northwards and retreated uphill. So of course, the AONB being a hilly area is a place where we tend to find them now as the only places to find them. The Willow Warbler, a long distance migrant, has disappeared from much of the Thames and Chilterns region. There's still quite a few left up in Bedfordshire and North Hertfordshire, but you'll see that in Berkshire and Oxfordshire, it's only really the Downs now where we find them. Similarly, the meadow pipit, a bird of upland moorland, used to be rather more widely distributed, and you'll see from the change map that a lot of red spots in the low-lying areas, but still a few on the tops of the downs. Again, though, they are disappearing on our five farmland plots. 3 of them are repeat plots from 2 years ago, and I think we've now lost meadow pipit from those as well. So what's the value of the North Wessex Downs? Well, here's a word for you to use: heterogeneity. In other words, variety. We have still quite a good varied landscape. This is a view from Lowbury Hill, which will be known to those of you from Berkshire looking towards West Ilsley. I think we've got at least one delegate from West Ilsley or hopefully looking at us. Ignore the water. This was during the very high groundwater of 2014. But in this view, you've got in the foreground some nice chalk grassland. You've got the standard arable there. You've got the wide corridor running through the middle that is, on the one hand, the Ridgeway, and then also the Fair Mile, which crosses and meets it, where you've got a nice wide verge with bushes and long grass. You've got racecourse gallops. Racehorse gallops are good, not for the main gallop area, but often where there are dead areas in between, the gallops manager leave long grass, and that's brilliant. We've got a landscape that has something for everybody, really, providing it's managed properly. We've got growing crops for some species, bare ground, although those of you involved with stone curlews will know that needs management to keep it bare, to keep it suitable for some of these specialist ground nesters. Chalk grassland for species like meadow pipits and also for feeding areas. Longer grassland for curlews, grey partridge, and also providing a seed crop for the seed eaters. And also, as I say, the hedges, scrubs, and field and track margins, which are again both a breeding and feeding habitat. So I'm about to hand back to Des, but I can't do so without thanking everybody that's helped produce the materials you've seen, the BTO in particular for giving me permission to reproduce their plans and maps, the regional and county maps from the various publications, all of whom kindly allowed me to reproduce them, and of course to all the hundreds of volunteers that produced the data that went into them. And I guess also to those of you out there, landowners who permitted us, where there weren't public rights of way, to gain access to actually carry out the surveys. So I think now we have a break, don't we, for questions?
We do indeed.
Well, thank you very much, Des and Neil, for most informative but actually quite worrying presentations. I hadn't realised that birds were quite so badly in decline. Yes, we do have time for some questions, and I'll hand over to Corinna and Henry, who will be able to read them.
Thank you. So we have one question, well, we've got a number of questions, and the first question is from Richard Charles. One of the principal reasons for the decline in farmland birds is a large increase in the populations of corvids. Why is this not recognised and an action plan made to do something about it?
Shall I start with that one, Neil? Well, thanks for that question, and it's obviously a big issue. I've talked, and we will talk more about some of the habitat changes, but there have been lots of other changes in the countryside that have impacted wildlife and birds. Just in the last year, we've seen the huge amounts of recreational activity in the countryside, which has been marvellous, but does sometimes have impacts on wildlife. And actually in many parts of the North Wessex Downs, some of the best areas of habitat are along some of the very busy rights of way. So that brings pressure, which makes it even more important to provide lots of habitat in less disturbed parts of the farmed landscape. Regarding predation, it does have an impact, and it seriously impacts some species a lot more than others. Some of our declined birds, like the lapwing and the grey partridge, through the nature of their breeding cycle, they are sometimes very, very vulnerable to predation. And we know that we've got a a big increase in predators in the countryside just since when I started working in the area. Birds like the buzzard and the raven and the kite were sort of unknown from the North Wessex Downs. Now they're all very common species. The line that Natural England must obviously take is that there are many predators which cause problems which can be controlled legally, things like foxes, corvids. There are some predators which we know occasionally take declining farmland birds that are protected so that they can't be controlled. But we do know that if we get the habitats right for a lot of these species, they can and will recover. Many estates, I think there's another question about shooting estates. Many estates still employ keepers who are undertaking some predator control. And even on nature reserves, we know that predator control can help with the survival of certain target species. Often, if that predator control is done in a targeted, focused way, it can make real impacts. So I take that question really seriously. The government, through stewardship schemes, we've never included sort of bespoke payments for predator control within a lot of the options. I'm not sure on all of the policy and that behind that, but we know it can help.
Yeah, I think this may be coming up in the next question, because this is obviously a sensitive issue, and indeed between scientists and conservationists, there's now a debate underway, because those people particularly interested in ground nesting birds, there's a lot of people studying wading species, for example, are concerned that one of the adverse factors is predation. And as Des says, there seems to be an increase in the number of predators. It's not just corvids, ground predators. In fact, ground predators are the worst in terms of impact on nesting birds from most of the scientific studies that have been done. But one of the factors that is now being focused upon as being the reason why I've got so many of these generalist predators, for want of a better expression, is because of a very high population of game birds that are introduced into the countryside. The poor old gamekeeper gets shot at from all sides. Although perhaps rather people say he should be shooting at the corvids, perhaps, I don't know. But I think also possibly the standards of game management aren't what they were, and there are people who are indiscriminately releasing large number of game birds that end up as fast food on our roads when they come to grief, which feeds large numbers of all kinds of predators, everything from grey squirrels, rats, weasels, stoats, foxes, badgers, all the corvid species, red kite and everything else. And the thought is that that's maintaining the population of some of those birds at a high level. Whether there is a total direct link to, therefore, predation of other species is still a bit of an open question. And certainly some of the people who are doing high intensity conservation work on birds like curlews, that involves actually going out, would you believe, with electric fences and fencing around the nest sites to keep the ground predators off. You obviously can't do the flying predators that way. And that does appear to be effective, albeit a very, very labour-intensive way of dealing with things.
Thank you both. We have another question following on the one that you just answered, also from Trudy Wrighton, saying, I was on the island of Mull recently, and I noticed that some areas, Benmore Estate, for example, seem to have large numbers of lapwing. I was pleasantly surprised to see them. So what can we learn from how those landlords are managing their land to encourage the birds?
Right. Des, do you want to go first? Or?
I can try. Yeah, a little on more on the shooting estates. I've worked with a lot of farms and estates, some of which have shoots and some don't. And I think that the way the shooting estates manage their shoot and manage all the habitats has a big impact on whether they're benefiting wildlife or not. And some shooting estates are doing fantastic things that really benefit the wildlife as well as enabling them to manage a shoot. Others perhaps could do more and hopefully can be encouraged to do more going forward. The old traditional game cover of maize or giant sorghum doesn't do a lot for wildlife, but some of the other types of covers and habitats can be fantastic for wildlife as well as for the shoot. So hopefully there's room for both. As Neil said, the numbers of birds put out, they do create competition for food. They do create that increase in predators, and they can put increased pressure. So a shoot that's releasing lots of red-legged partridge, for instance, those birds will provide competition for native wild grey partridge and can have some impacts there. It is complex. I've never been up to, where was it? Up in Scotland somewhere. We've lost a lot of lapwings from lowland Britain for all sorts of reasons. I'm thinking that where we have lost them, it's very hard to get them back. So I think if you've still got populations of lapwings on your farm, it's so crucial to do everything you can to hang on to them. We get quite a lot of lapwings in the UK in the winter, but they're sort of different populations to the ones that perhaps are nesting and breeding. So don't be fooled that, oh, we always have lots of lapwings and then they all disappear for some reason. It's a different group to the breeding population. But where with the predation issue again, where we've got decent numbers of birds like lapwings, they can group together and try and defend their local colonies better. Where you've just got one or two pairs left, it's such hard work for the birds to defend against predators that they're often unsuccessful. So if you have got decent population numbers, and this is where cluster farmer groups working together can really join forces, because if there is a reservoir of birds in an area, it's so much easier to get them to just build up their numbers again than where we've lost them completely. To try and attract them back is hard going. I don't know about the landscape or anything on the estate you've referred to, so I'm not sure I can comment further on that.
Well, I'm happy to make a comment because I've also, last week I was actually up in North West Scotland myself, and I only had a day on Mull and it rained all day, so I didn't see very much at all. But I also had a day out on the Ardnamurchan Peninsula, and by contrast, I did the Kintyre 66, which is a driving route all the way around Kintyre. And on the way up and way down, I stayed in North Yorkshire and visited a nature reserve I know well there, where there were great numbers of lapwing chicks, but that was because it was a nature reserve. Some of those places in northwest Scotland don't have intensive grassland management. Certainly on Ardnamurchan, again, I had a similar sort of experience. Good numbers of birds, but it was on rough grassland. In Kintyre, by contrast, I went down the west coast, intensively managed grassland, big dairy area. Almost everywhere it had a deep shave for silage, just taken off it recently, and I didn't see a single lapwing. So, and those maps you'll have seen that I put up, a lot of the biggest declines in farmland birds are actually not in the arable lands of the east. They're in the grasslands of the west, where I think grassland management is being recognised as one of the main problems for some of our farmland birds. Anyway, I think it's time now for part 2, isn't it?
Yes, thank you, guys. Yes, we have another presentation now from Des. He's going to talk us through the 3 most beneficial countryside stewardship options for farmland birds. And we can pick up any questions at the end after his presentation. So over to you, Des.
Thank you very much. Is my slides showing up?
Yep, all good.
Okay, good. So following on from where we've just been talking, I'll talk a little bit now about some of the habitats that can be provided, the habitats and resources that can be provided on and around farms. A lot of what I'll talk about is based on stewardship agreements and stewardship type management. There's more than one way to skin a cat though, and many farms are doing really exciting things outside of stewardship under their own steam. The stewardship obviously does come with its rules and regulations, the do's and don'ts. And there are opportunities on perhaps unproductive parts of the farm to do exciting things for wildlife, whether it's in stewardship or not. And I would say there that a lot of what we want created on farms for wildlife can be done on some of those less productive parts of the farm. We're not asking people to give up really good value cropping land in a big way. So mentioned in my earlier talk that three things that birds really need. We know that farmland birds need safe nesting sites. They need plenty of insect food in the spring to rear their chicks. Almost all songbirds and some other farmland birds depend on insects for feeding their young. And the insects need to be available, plentiful, and close to where the nest sites are. And also winter food, mainly seeds for overwinter survival. So through the ELS and HLS days, Natural England developed what we called the farm bird package. And we talked about the big three, those three requirements. We weren't talking about the osprey, the eagle and the condor when we talked about the big three. It was the habitats they need. If you provide those, then the birds have got a great chance of recovering their populations. Through the current Countryside Stewardship Programme, that's evolved into what DEFRA is packaging as the wild pollinator and farm wildlife package, thinking a bit wider than just birds, into plants, insects, pollinators, and all the other farm wildlife which we enjoy, things like the bats and the hares, hedgehogs, things like that should be using our countryside. So the farm wildlife package is very similar in terms of those three resources that we're looking for farms to provide. We're looking for plentiful nectar and pollen sources, which provides all those insects, not only for pollination, but also as important parts of the food chain, and also as an important insect conservation measure. We need the safe nesting sites and also hibernation and sheltering sites for other species as well, and winter food for seed-eating birds. I'm doubling up a bit with some of what Neil said, and I'm not going to apologise for that, but the Downs and North Wessex have got some wonderful landscapes, and in many places we've got a very high diversity of habitats within the local landscape. This photo shows some ancient grassland, flower-rich grassland. It's got some more improved grassland, more agriculturally productive, copses, some scrub on the banks. You can see there's some arable on the gentler slopes. And most importantly, around the arable, you can see a strip, an uncultivated strip, which had been prepared as a stewardship option. So lots of diversity within that small part of the landscape. Again, a different area. This field has got a similar diversity of semi-natural habitats. It's got some ancient grassland, hedgerows, some scrub and trees, some woodlands. Also, you can see around some of the fields, the colourful poppies, where there's some headlands. Again, probably in a stewardship type option. There's some patches of bare ground in there. This was taken in the spring. Those have been prepared for a mixture of game covers and also wild bird seed mixes. And the large plot on the top was actually a big fallow area for the nesting lapwings and stone curlews on this farm on the sort of stony, flinty ground. So again, diversity in the landscape will help to produce diversity of wildlife. So research, DEFRA has funded an enormous amount of research into the development of stewardship, and I daren't even think how much work's going on to developing the ELMS scheme at the moment. But we know through the development of ELS, HLS, and the current Countryside Stewardship, we know from some of the research and development that if farms put between 5 and 10%, probably hopefully a minimum of about 5% of the farmed area into good quality habitats, that will help to enable farmland bird populations to recover and other wildlife. And that will turn those lines on those graphs upwards. But, and it's a big but, it needs to be done across the whole landscape for it to really make a difference. We know many farms have done really well and they've kept the birds going, often increased them spectacularly on their own farms. But we need this at a landscape scale to really make a difference nationally. So we need, the ask, if you like, is that we have a minimum of 2% of the farmed area with plentiful flowers to provide that insect food. We want a minimum of 1% of the farmed area for shelter, nesting or hibernation type habitats, perhaps less disturbed habitats. And we need a minimum of 2% providing seed-rich habitats through the winter. And I'll go through a few slides now, talking about some of the different types of way that those resources can be provided for different birds. As I mentioned, we know it works. One of the best parts of my job is going to visit a farm and seeing a wildflower margin like that someone had created just by stopping, ploughing up to that corner of the hedge and sowing a mix. It takes a bit of management. These wildflower margins, if you get them going, they can last a long time. They may be a little expensive to get started, but once they're in, if they're well managed, they could last. Well, wildflower meadows obviously have lasted centuries. So if well managed, these can last a long time. And the benefits to wildlife, just incredible. Locating a margin like that near to a public footpath or something like that will obviously have massive benefits for the public walking and enjoying seeing the habitats that you've created on your farm. So it may obviously, if you're trying to attract sensitive birds that you don't want their nest disturbed, then you would want to have some of these well away from footpaths. And the big flock of linnets, again, going out in the winter and seeing flocks like that over some of the game, the wild bird covers and game strips that have been created is a really, really rewarding part of my job. And I know for the farmers that do this, it's a rewarding for them to see the products. So most of the stewardship options do require you to grow things, and we know that's what farmers do best. That's their day job, growing things. We're just asking you to grow some slightly different crops for a different sort of harvest. The harvest being the wildlife. Often it means a slightly different mindset about what your objectives are, but the nuts and bolts of it are about sowing or preparing ground, sowing, establishing, managing and maintaining, caring for it. So some of the different habitats that can provide nectar and pollen sources, which then provide insect-rich habitats through the spring, can include flowery margins or the sort of out of a packet nectar, pollen and nectar mixes. On the top right hand there, you've got a pollen and nectar mix full of clovers and vetches. Those mixes tend to only last 3 or 4 years, depending how they're managed. An old mistake with those was to include grasses in there. The grasses tend to swamp out the flowers. So stick to mixes that don't have grass in these days. Most of the seed suppliers provide bespoke mixes for these sorts of habitats now. Another really important farmland habitat that provides lots of flowers is the hedgerows. And down at the bottom, you can see some blossom on some of the hedgerows, but the amount of blossom depends on how they're managed. What we want farms to aim for, again, going back to that word diversity, if you provide a diversity of different habitats, and flowering sources to provide flowers from early spring, perhaps in the hedgerows with the blackthorn and then hawthorn, right through the summer and into the autumn through different types of habitats. That will cater for wildlife right through that prolonged period of the year. So things like the hedgerows, cultivated areas for arable plants can provide good early spring nectar, and then the bespoke nectar mixes or flowery margins, which may be ancient flowery margins that you've managed to protect and maintain over the years, or may be ones that you're going to establish yourself using seeds. Another option in the stewardship is the legume and herb-rich swards, or there's the 2-year legume fallow, which can also help with blackgrass control. Also, don't forget other semi-natural habitats that you've got around the farm. Often there are wet, soggy areas that you find difficult to manage. They can really be rich in plants, often things like water mints. And if you've already got features that are full of flowers, maybe that's doing the job for you. You don't need to work too hard. Just make sure you're maintaining those areas to deliver what the wildlife needs through the spring and summer. The banks of ditches, ancient meadows, they can all be really valuable. So hedgerows can provide a mass of blossom and flowers in the spring if they're not trimmed every year. If they're trimmed every year, they really don't provide nearly as much. So having a rotational system of trimming hedges every 2 or preferably 3 years or longer can really maximize and increase the amount of blossom there. Here in the picture, we've got some blackthorn, and down in the bottom, some hawthorn, 2 of our commonest hedgerow species, so valuable for all the insects. In May, the blossoms are absolutely humming with insects around the hawthorn, and birds like the whitethroat I've got in the picture there, a pretty common bird of hedgerows and the countryside, but birds like that are depending on all those insects for their food. Also, these varieties of hedgerow plant and other hedgerow plants like the hazel and other thorns, bramble itself, they all are really great plants for having lots of different caterpillars and things like that on them that are good brood rearing food as well. And if we have a mass of blossom in the spring on the hedgerows, that also means we have a bountiful harvest of berries in the autumn and winter for birds like, there's a fieldfare in the picture there, that's one of our wintering thrushes. These birds flock to Britain because they know that they're hoping that the larder will be full when they arrive here. If all of our hedgerows are allowed to grow a bit more and not be trimmed quite so often, then that harvest will be there for them when they arrive. Conservation headlands, this is where the outer strip of the crop is not actually fertilized or sprayed, and it can be done through stewardship. But you can see in this picture that the headland has got a fairly thin crop with lots of poppies in it, and then out into the field there's no poppies. So this headland and conservation headlands can be really valuable for some of our rarer plants, rarer arable flowers, and really valuable foraging places for birds like the partridge and other songbirds that can get in amongst the crop and root around for insects and other food in there. So conservation headlands, not the most popular of stewardship option, but a really valuable one if that's one that you can do. Always the concern about the weed risks. So when you're thinking about where to locate options, stewardship options on some of these habitats, do think about your own weed burdens on the farm, and don't go locating them where you're perhaps setting yourself up to fail. So things like conservation headlands, they do want to be located where there's a pretty low risk of weed burdens. And if you're so inclined, you can even leave some of the headlands unharvested to actually provide winter seed as well. Uncropped cultivated margins, this one in North Hampshire, not too far from Basingstoke actually. It looks like a mass of poppies, but this one was just cultivated when the field was cultivated, but this wasn't drilled with the crop. So there's it's an uncropped cultivated margin. Has some very rare arable flora in here. Again, a really valuable habitat for lots of the wildlife, not only to forage in, but some birds will be nesting in there. Many of our songbirds do actually nest within the crop and within things like hay meadows or grasslands. So they are vulnerable to being having their nests destroyed by your routine farming practices. So having safe areas in and around the fields can be really valuable to provide a bit more opportunity for more successful nests. That was a bit about providing some flowers for insects. Safe nesting and hibernation and sheltering sites. Some of the wildflower margins and areas like that around your buffer strips, around hedgerows, along hedgerows and around the edges of fields can be really valuable. So it can sometimes double up as being good insect habitat as well. But things like beetle banks, low input cereals, fallow plots, which I'll show you in a moment, skylark plots, grassy buffer strips around the edges of the field can all be important. Low input grassland is a really important nesting site, depending on the timing of cuts. And I know that I'll be shouted down by a lot of farms, but if when you're cutting your hay, if you leave it a bit messy, or even if you're cutting silage, if you leave a few patches, or then as the grass regrows, it often gives a head start for birds like the skylark to dive into some of those uncut patches and start a new nesting attempt. We know that if there's at least 8 weeks between cuts, some of the birds can get their nesting cycle completed before your next cut of silage or hay. That's only if they start nesting straight away after the first cut. So giving them a chance to get in there early is another sort of idea that you can use. So we're hoping that farms can provide at least a hectare of sort of nesting and sheltering type habitat around the farm. As I mentioned earlier, some of the flowery margins and buffer strips can provide that. Here in this photo, we've got some beans in the field and then a strip of, they're weeds really. It's the whitish flowers is mayweeds, but then across on the right, you have got a flowery margin going up to the hedge. And where those tall grasses and flowers grow up into the base of a dense hedge, which is nice and bushy right down to the ground, that is often where lots of the birds will be nesting. They don't all nest at the top of bushes. A lot of them are nesting low down in the vegetation around the hedge bases of hedge banks. So they're vulnerable, for instance, to using those margins as tracks. Hopefully you're not going to use those buffer strips and grassy margins as vehicle tracks, because that's where a lot of the birds might be nesting, just tucked in there. It doesn't want to be cut during the nesting season. You could easily undo all the good work you've done by cutting too early. And where you've got hedgerows that are very gappy at the bottom, or they may be bushier higher up, but from sort of waist or knee down, they're just stalks. Try and rejuvenate some of those hedges if you can, so they're nice and bushy right down to the ground. Here you can see a view up towards Lambourne, this farm. It's a green lane or a farm track down between a double hedge, and you can see big wide hedges with big wide grassy flowery strips either side. So that's providing some real nesting and sheltering habitat. And on those sorts of areas, there's lots of opportunities for birds like the linnet, the yellowhammer, and others, the barn owl and the kestrel to hunt. Really, really good to see that sort of space given for wildlife along the edges of the arable crops. This one, probably taken from not far from where Neil took his picture from, near at Lowbury Hill. This farm had put in lots and lots of skylark plots in some of the fields. Those little squares, the little patches that look like the seed all died in those areas. Well, it may have either been sprayed out, or just turn the drill off when establishing that crop. And those little patches just provide a bit of structural diversity in the fields. And although the birds might not actually nest in those patches give the birds a sort of a landing platform so they can get into the crop later in the summer as the crop's maturing. And birds like the yellow wagtail and skylark, that can help them to increase the amount of successful nesting opportunities they have in those fields. So although they've not been the most popular stewardship option, they're quite easy to do. They don't cost you too much. They will get a bit weedy, but you can overspray them. You don't need to turn the spray off when you're going over them, but obviously there's no crop competition in those plots, but you can overspray them. So again, think about where you're located and perhaps not where you've got serious black grass issues, but do try and put in some of those small patches. They do work and they do help the birds. Larger fallow plots. So here's my lovely yellow arrow is pointing down at a large fallow plot. This one's actually in amongst some grassland areas, but fallow plots are really important for nesting lapwing and stone curlew in some areas. They do need preparing in the spring to provide a rather bare open ground, but do leave some patches in there, some structure. The comment about predation earlier, the chicks of the lapwing and the stone curlew are quite vulnerable to predation. So having some cover in there for those chicks to conceal themselves is important. We do know that the birds in Berkshire and Oxfordshire on the downs, certainly the stone curlews, although they're not the most productive of birds, some years recently, they have had quite good productivity in spite of all those predators that are around. So these plots can work. Getting the habitat in the right place and well managed with the right sort of structure can really work for these really rare birds. And the last resource, traditionally, this was the one that was more popular with shooting estates. So providing winter food plots for seed-eating birds, and farms with a shoot, the wild bird seed mixes could often double up as helping the shoot. What we found 20 odd years ago was that many farms were including these plots in their stewardship applications, but not including all of the flowers and nesting sites. So we only had a part of the life cycle catered for. So getting all three parts of the life cycle catered for and distributed across your farm, not just all bunched in one corner, getting patches distributed across the farm so the wildlife can move around and find it. Doesn't need to fly miles from its nest site to find some food, or fly a long way from one resource to the other. So we've got quite a lot of research showing what sort of seeds are really valuable for different birds. And on this table, you've got some of the key farmland birds like the corn bunting and the yellowhammer, the grey partridge and the linnet. And you can see a number of the seeds there appear in every single row or in lots of rows. Things like the kale provides first-year cover and second-year seed. Quinoa is a really valuable seed source. Cereals are important for the buntings, like the yellowhammer and corn bunting. Barley and triticale is often used. And the other things like millets, linseeds, mustards. If you're growing wild bird seed plots for the birds, again, diversity. Include a number of different species of seed and varieties of seed in there. Don't put all your eggs or all your seeds in one basket. The more varieties you include in a mix, the more chance some have got of coming really good, and you'll benefit a variety of birds. The traditional bird seed mixes are sown in the spring and can provide feed for 1 or 2 years. Certainly if you include kale in the mix and get it going well, they can last for 2 years. Think when you're establishing it that you're not actually growing it for a harvest in summer, you're growing it for a harvest in the winter. The harvest is the seeds for the birds in the winter. So we have some very odd springs, and I feel sorry for everyone trying to establish anything some springs. But some of these mixes, even if they're sown as late as June, can still actually have a really good harvest of seeds for the birds the following winter. So some of the stewardship options that help providing the seed, we've got winter bird seed mixes. The bumblebird seed mixes can be autumn sown and provide nectar sources as well as seeds. So that's a slightly different one, can be better on soils that are more akin to autumn establishment. Stubbles can be good, especially if they've got plenty of broadleaf weeds, excuse me, in amongst them. Unharvested headlands or unharvested ryegrass, and a lot of farms, especially with shoots, do supplementary feeding for that hungry gap at the end of the winter. So in this picture, I've got a couple of different seed mixes. On the left is the 2-year mix. This is got plenty of fodder radish seeds I can see there, and plenty of kale in there. And on the right was a 1-year mix with the quinoa. Again, if you've got some of these mixes near to public footpaths, including things like some sunflowers in them, can be really popular with ramblers, and also really popular with some of the birds. Things like greenfinches love the sunflowers. There's a mix sown along beside a hedgerow. Think about where you're locating these mixes. Just putting it in the shady side of a tall woodland may only actually be benefiting the pigeons and the rabbits. Locating it out in the open by a hedgerow will benefit the birds that we're trying to target. There's proof of the pudding, a hedge there with, I can't count them, lots of little golden flags in the hedge. They're all yellow hammers, and hopefully if all this works across the countryside, we'll be seeing that sort of site a lot more in the future. And the flock of linnets there. So, as I say, remember, it's about quality as much as quantity. I said earlier, you're good at growing things, so put some effort and thought into how you grow these things. We have got some good agronomy advice, and many of these seed merchants provide bespoke advice for their seeds mixes. Think about the locations where you're putting things. If you're growing flowers for butterflies and insects, it wants to be in a sunny location with some shelter. Co-location of options can help. Protect sensitive semi-natural habitats. Avoid weedy or waterlogged areas for some of these options. Think about the size of the plots that you're putting in. Small and narrow plots can actually become quite fiddly to manage and quite frustrating. Think about when you're going to need to access these plots during the farming year. Here's an interesting example of a farm.
Yes. Sorry, can I give you a 5-minute warning here, because we're coming up against time, please?
Yeah, I think I only needed a 1-minute warning. Okay. I'm nearly there. Sorry.
All right, 1 minute then.
That's brilliant. Yeah, so this farm had actually put a mixture of options, co-locating them. So we've got, instead of just having a beetle bank down through the middle of a wheat field, next to the beetle bank on one side is what is a flowery margin, and on the right-hand side of the beetle bank is what is the bird seed mix. This photo was taken in quite early spring, before the flowers had started to show much, and before the bird seed mix had really started to grow. But you can see it's been drilled, the rows there. And in very big fields, actually this was in a big field, and this farm has got a number of these sort of habitat clusters across the field. These habitats don't go right to the end of the field. The wheat goes around at either end of the habitat blocks, so there's still a chance to manage your crop successfully. And as I mentioned, there is lots of guidance. I think we're going to be providing some websites and resources as a part of the outputs from the talk. So I'm just about done there. So sorry I went on a bit too long, but hopefully that was useful.
Thank you very much, Des. Sorry about that.
No.
So we have time now for a couple quick questions.
Great, thank you very much, Des. We have a question from Lucy Charman, specifically relating to the slide you showed of all the Skylark plots. At least I think it was. She says, the multiple lapwing plots shown in your lovely landscape image do appear to be small in size. I thought they had to be minimum 1 hectare each. They look very small to qualify for AB5 options. I'm not sure if that's whether that's relating to the lapwing photo or the Skylark photo.
Okay, I showed a picture with lots of small plots. They were Skylark plots, which I think have to be a minimum of 3 meters by 3 meters. They're very different to the big lapwing plots. The idea of the Skylark plots is to put quite a lot of small patches into a winter wheat crop. You're dead right, for a lapwing, for the AB5, it's got to be a minimum of 1 hectare. So that's a very different type of habitat for a different objective.
Okay. I've got a question here from Trudy Wrighton. She essentially is asking about the 3 things that you would suggest that we could how to do to encourage farmers and action for birds that would have the most impact in the shortest time.
Well, if you're working with a farmer, I think enthuse to them about how much they can do through with some paid grants through things like stewardship, and some of the things that they can do. They do take quite a lot of time and effort, but they can be very rewarding. I think going forward, as we're seeing the changes to basic payment and the introduction of the public payments for public goods, these sorts of things will be funded. We don't know the level of funding at the moment, so it would be rash of me to say it's going to be how economically viable it's going to be in any particular farm scenario. If you're a bird enthusiast, I think, doing some surveys, as Neil and his team do, perhaps he'll say a bit more in a moment, doing a few bird surveys and letting the farm know what they've got. Perhaps in one of my jobs, I try and say, look what you've done here. This flock of 1,000 linnets or these breeding birds, wouldn't be here without what you've been doing. Just letting people know what they've got on their land. Farmers are often really knowledgeable about what's on their land, but some of these, we all know some wildlife is very hard to identify, and some of the small brown jobs can be a bit tricky. So farms are often really delighted to know they've got their barn owls or the lapwings, but some of the smaller SBJs, the small brown jobs, if you can give them sort of reports or updates on how they're doing and perhaps what they might be able to do more of. I'm going to ask Neil if he wants to come in here, because this is something he and his team are actually doing.
Yes, we've started to, it was really a follow-on from the Atlas. We first of all, Des kindly gave us put us in touch with a few farmers who are in stewardship, and we've done a few surveys on their farms, reported back to them what they're doing. We're now trying to do it on a rather more organised basis, especially in anticipation, hopefully, of some farmer clusters being set up in our part of the world. So we've got, as I say, 5 plots going at the moment in and around Compton, Churn, West Ilsley, in anticipation that clusters are going to start there with some of the landowners there that we know and who welcome us anyway. Although actually a lot of our area you can cover from public rights of way anyway. It can be a bit of a problem getting enough volunteers. So we're probably going to have to be, when we get this up and running, we'll probably be doing farms once every 2 or 3 years if they want it done on a sort of monitoring basis. But we're more than happy to do that. And, if you are interested, get in touch through the Berkshire Ornithological Club website if you're in our part of the world. And if you're not, don't worry. We can put you in touch with people in Wiltshire, Hampshire and Oxfordshire who might also be able to help. But going back to the three things, I think there are two things that I would say, or one thing I would say really, some of these things are actually things you can do by not having to do anything. As Des says, cut down on the number of times you cut back on your hedges. There's a very, very easy thing to do. And also, don't swipe your verges all the time too, because you're quite likely going to be taking out a food or nesting resource for your farmland birds if you're making the sides of your tracks look like the local golf club. So those are some things that you can do before you even start picking up one of Des's leaflets and looking at the serious stuff.
Okay.
Thank you, Neil. Just for everyone's benefit, I'm sure we can circulate this with the follow-up to this webinar, but do you want to just say the website address that you referred to?
Hang on a second. Let me just see if I can remember it. I got it as a shortcut. Well, if you Google Berkshire Ornithological Club, you'll get us, but I will look it up on my...
You'll be fine. Don't worry. It wasn't meant to be a trick question.
I should also just say, Henry, that Des and Neil have been very organised and already provided us with lots of links to various websites and sources of information. So we will be circulating that after the webinar.
I think we're now running out of time, everybody. So I think we have to wrap up now. And thank you, everybody, for the questions. For Anna Tarrant, who's actually driving the system behind the scenes. And also especially to Des and Neil for their time and their really useful presentations. One thing I'd like to mention is we're hoping to do these webinars once every couple of months. But with the advent of the farming in protected landscapes coming up on the horizons, we hope to be able to do a detailed webinar on that on the 15th of July. We'll let you know as soon as we know. And if you can take a minute to fill out the forms and give us some feedback, what might be useful going forward, that would be really, really helpful. Thank you very much for joining us, and bye-bye. Thank you.